Hello, this is Mike Wurzman, and I want to welcome you to our Introduction to EU REACH webinar. I've been working with AEM now on several years to help craft an industry-wide approach, and I've been working in the regulatory compliance field for over 10 years now, starting with ROS, ELV, and other directives. We are using this base of knowledge of what has been shown in the past to craft our path going forward for REACH. And today, we're going to be covering just the basics of REACH, what it's about, and why we should care and why we need to take action. So let's start out. The most basic thing people ask is, what is REACH? And REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization of Chemicals. The program is administered out of the EU by the European Chemicals Agency, and you'll usually hear them referred to as ECH. Now, REACH was put in with one primary goal: for the protection of human health and the environment. Now, we take a look at it with the data collected in Europe, especially through their socialized medicine, where they could take a look at areas, chemicals, do relationships. They realized it was much cheaper to prevent illness than cure it. In fact, it was virtually a 5-to-1 ratio. For every dollar spent in preventing exposure to toxic chemicals that were creating illnesses, there is literally a 5-fold savings in longer-term public health costs. With this type of a driver, it's clear to see that not only is REACH here to stay, we can expect it to expand and grow. And keep in mind, these types of exposures and costs are not limited to the EU, but they affect global economies in the same way. So we can see where with the human health issue, this is being driven by money. It's about the money and the savings. But also from the environmental side, we're so used to hearing people talk about greenhouse gas and the dangers there, we have to take a look at what are the dangers environmentally, not just to our exposure to these chemicals to the environment, but the secondary impacts. And what many people forget is that the 100 crop species that provide 90% of the food in this world, 71 of those are bee pollinated. Many of the others are pollinated by butterflies and other type of insects. In Europe, 84% of the 264 crop species are animal pollinated, again, mostly by insects. And when we think about the 4,000 vegetable varieties pollinated by bees, you can see where the problems of these toxic chemicals getting into the environment and killing off the bees, the other insects, the other animals required for pollination could have a massive and totally disruptive impact on our food supplies. So it's not just about direct human health, it's about being able to provide food. So what is this whole concept of REACH, this complex legislation based on? And it's the precautionary principle. Now, in the past, we've looked at when we create chemicals, unless you had a specific reason to believe it was harmful, it was considered good and put on the market until we found out there were problems. The precautionary principle basically states if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment in the absence of scientific consensus that the action or policy is harmful, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking action. In other words, anything new is assumed guilty unless proven innocent. So because there's not the scientific knowledge, we have to make the assumption that we have the risk. So it's a twist, a whole different approach being taken, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, let's get down to REACH. What is REACH going to mean for us? Now, in the EU, there's a lot of additional areas and responsibilities, but let's just take a look at the 4 key parts that affect us as U.S. manufacturers exporting into the EU. And the first area is what a lot of us have heard about, this SVHCs, or substances of very high concern, and what we call the candidate list of substances for inclusion in Annex 14, or inclusion in the authorization list. When a substance has evidence of being harmful, it is proposed to be a authorization substance. I'll get to in a minute. Once it's put on this list, it triggers reporting requirements throughout the supply chain. And the key here is that you have the immediate declaration responsibility on the next product being shipped into the EU. So I've got it on a boat, it's traveling to the EU, they add a new substance officially to the SVHC candidate list. I have to be able to declare to the person importing it the next day whether or not it contains that substance. Now that's quite a task, and getting that put in and enforcing the rest is much of what they're still working on. We'll get to more in a moment. The second is the authorization list that these items are a candidate to. When an item is moved to the authorization list, it is saying it's no longer allowed to be made in the EU, used in products in the EU, and has dates by which it can no longer be designed into products, and must a sunset date by which it has to be phased out, unless there is a specific authorization of use granted. Now, when a substance goes to the authorization list, it still stays on the candidate list, because the candidate list is what triggers all of the reporting responsibilities for REACH compliance. The next one is, and the one most commonly overlooked, the restrictions list, what they call Annex 17. These are substances that cannot be used in products made or shipped into the EU. And it oftentimes has substances that were on previous chemical legislation. In fact, all the previous chemical legislations were rolled up pretty much into this restrictions list. And the last one is the registration of substances or preparations. Now, if we're selling a chemical or a preparation into the EU over 1 metric ton a year, it must be registered, and that means supplying the data per the requirements of REACH on that substance and its impact on health and the environment. That includes all the oils, fluids, and chemicals that we may be selling to support our equipment, or as maintenance equipment, or others. And it also requires that we register any substances that have intentional release from products. And the traditional one everyone hears about is, you think about in your bathroom, the potpourri, the fragrance that comes out of that is a substance that would have to be registered. So if you have any items that go into a cap to deodorize, those items that deodorize would need to be registered if the release of that over the year is over 1 ton. And the key thing here is that it must be done by a legal entity in the EU, so they've set up what they call only representatives, which is a person who has standing in the EU, so action can be taken against, but has a relationship contractually with companies outside the EU for being able to pass the responsibilities along to. And you're required, if you do not have an EU presence, to use an only representative for that, so that there's a way to cross the international borders legally for any penalties. Now let's go into the candidate list a little more and why it's of such a critical nature. Right now there are 155 substances, a very high concern on the candidate list. 22 are being proposed, and last I heard we expect possibly only 10 of those will be added here shortly. That list is expected to grow ultimately to over 1,500 substances. And we have to keep in mind some substances will not make the list because they'll be voluntarily phased out of the EU, although there may be use in production, intermediaries, in production elsewhere in the world. So just because it's not on that list doesn't mean it's not harmful. It just means the risk of harms in the EU are lower than other chemicals. Now, there's no prohibition on the content of SVHC substances in articles we export that are imported into the EU. Philosophy being we can contaminate, poison our own people. China can do the same. If it's in an article, they're just worried about it being declared, what the safe handling is, and proper disposal. But they don't want the exposures, especially during manufacturing, where usually the most toxic impacts are, to take place in the EU. Now, Article 33 of REACH requires communications to EU downstream, industrial, professional users, and distributors. Basically, everybody we sell our equipment to, we are required to report the content of any of the SVHCs if they cross the 0.1% weight-per-weight threshold in an article. There is no minimum threshold on the total amount as there was on the registration requirement. And that information must include the safe use and handling over the life of the product. For example, if I have a hand grip made from a PVC that uses DEHP as a plasticizer, gives a nice feel, I have to explain to a person the safe handling, that they shouldn't be using that directly against their hand, and what over the end of life should be the proper disposal of that. At the basic minimum, if that type of information is not known, we have to provide the identification of it in our product. And critical is it goes down to the article being shipped. If I'm shipping a tractor, it's based on the tractor. If I'm shipping a replacement part, it's the individual part that comes in. In other words, since I have that immediate communication, I have to know my full material substance content of my entire product in advance before shipping to be REACH compliant. Now, the restrictions list is over 518 pages long, 63 substances or substance groups, and it is separate from the SVHC list, a separate fraud process in the EU for putting items on it, and an item can be on both lists. For example, cadmium. I can't use it over 0.01% for the threshold for this one, except in paints and polymers for safety purposes, where it's viewed that the safety of keeping that color strong and visible over a long life is more important than the risk of exposures. There's also exceptions for mining, aerospace, aeronautics, offshore, in nuclear sectors where there are very high safety standards, and for safety devices for road, agricultural vehicles, rolling stock, and vessels. But there's also a clause in there where, let's say I'm using it for an agricultural vehicle, if that bolt could come in contact with the food being processed by the machine, then it's not allowed. What this means is we many times will be using parts with cadmium for specific parts of equipment or markets, but not for others. And so we have to now be able to track a part by what it is, by the market and type of equipment it's going to be used in. Then many of the phthalates, for example, in the restrictions, the only phthalate restrictions are in child care products. And hexavalent chrome in cement mixtures down to a 20 parts per million dry weight. So if I'm using cement as a weight system on a crane, if it's in the concrete, I have to have it below a 20 ppm threshold, or I'm in violation. So the restriction list has many areas that we also have to be aware of in tracking. So it's a massive amount of data needed, most of which we do not have, and most of the reporting systems out there today do not adequately collect for reporting. So bottom line, we're required to know the substances in all our products shipped into the EU, and this is not an easy child's play exercise. Each spare and replacement part is an article on its own. So in the entire tractor, the weight of all the potential DEHP and other plasticizers may never be more than 0.1%, and there may be no reporting requirements unless there's a direct exposure potential. But if I sell an individual part, a replacement part, a seal, a gasket, a hose, I may have replacement deals. Now, 7 countries have said they believe the proper interpretation of REACH is once an article, always an article, which you'll often see as the OAAAA abbreviation. The EU has officially said, no, that's not how we are going to enforce it right now. But when you look at REACH carefully, you realize for it to truly be effective, ultimately, once they have it up and running, that's the direction it will have to go. So it makes sense to be prepared and not have to go through additional exercises later. So we no longer ship a product. We're shipping that product in literally a binder full of documentation on substance content. We're going to need to collect it in a way where we can tell what individual components are, what they're made and what's used on it, and which components went into which products. And for each homogeneous material that some of the legislation is based on, we're going to have to know the substances, and when there's confidential substances, know there's a link to the manufacturer of that substance. The only one who really knows and is required to update us should something need to be declared, and we need a system by which that can be done literally overnight. And our average supply chain depth is 11 tiers. We have ones going down to 20. Normal data process time is 3 weeks up and 3 weeks down per tier. Obviously, we're going to have ways that are far more efficient. Now, with that safe use and handling, one of the systems to use is the new GHS SDSs, and to create those for our product and tie it in and ship it with it. The EU has also said you could have a barcode link that brings up the information on your website, so you have a way to update it immediately as substances are added. Whatever way is chosen, and there isn't one required way, it just must be a way that works, we must be able to communicate that information. Now, I didn't talk about the communications or what's called notification to ECHA if we have substances over a given amount that haven't already been registered for the particular use we're using. So there can be additional ones as well, but that takes us too far down the rabbit hole for the purpose of today's webinar. So to comply, we have to meet registration requirements if there's any substances that are intentionally released, or we're shipping any substances, mixtures, preparations into the EU. They have to be registered. And we have to eliminate restricted substance use in our products where restrictions apply. Now, it doesn't stop there. It gets worse. one of the side consequences of REACH is what are we open to in this country? And I like to think of this as asbestos on steroids. All of this chemical safety information being collected in the EU is now part of the public domain. This is publicly available information for corporations. Therefore, there is no denial of knowledge in the use and exposure of that in the United States. So, if we use any SVH substances in our manufacturing processes, in our products, in the future, potentially, we could be held liable for damages. And then the question becomes for punitive, if this is publicly known or in reasonable business practices, we knew or would have access to this knowledge, will we be subject to punitive damages? It's too early to see what's going to happen, but class action lawyers are probably licking their chops saying, man, this is opening up a whole new area of business for them. So we can't ignore this, even if we are not shipping into the EU. We have to be aware of it. And not just in the EU, as other similar legislation is going on across the globe and this data becomes publicly available. We have to know what it is, be on top of it, know how to collect it, and know what to do with it. Now, the last part is we say, okay, how are they going to enforce this in the EU? Right now, if a product can be purchased or used by a consumer as some of the light-duty lawn and garden type equipment, lightweight yard tractors, if a consumer can buy it, then a consumer in the EU has the right to request from the retailer, at whatever level the retailer is, the REACH compliance data. And that retailer is required by law to have that to the consumer within 45 days of the request, or they are subject to fines and penalties. There's only one way to meet that, and that's to have it when it's shipped into the country if we are exporting. EU companies are then required to bring it in to supply it down to the downstream users of the SVHC content. And again, through our distributors, our importers of record, failure to have that data can trigger fines and penalties, not just a flat amount, but in some countries, it goes back to the date the product was imported, which means penalties can be assessed based on how many days that product has been coming in without documentation. So your importer can require you to have that data before allowing your product to pass through customs. So if I've got an EU competitor who has that data, he could go and say, hey guys, you know, here's got this data. If you don't have it from the other guy, you could be in trouble because enforcement goes by someone effectively ratting you out to the regulators right now. Once they have that data, they have to take some action on it. So we are starting to see it. I've already had one client whose EU customer said, without this data and evidence you meet the REACH requirements, we will not bring your product through customs. And we expect to begin seeing it. Now, the EU Enforcement Task Group recommended that customs begin requiring this REACH documentation on all product coming into the EU. So the bottom line is, your competitors can report you. You can get blocked by market access, by your importers, by anyone who is actually following the REACH. Now, the good news is the big attention is personal care and child care products. Our risk is more competitive short term, so if we get started and begin getting the data now, we can mitigate those risks, although, as I've seen, this can happen at any point in time. Now, if I've got to do all this, the most common thing I'd like to say is, I better have a way to make some money and improve my bottom line if I'm going to do this depth and work on compliance reporting. And with that, we've realized in looking at it that there really is a value proposition involved in accumulating this data. Not just the benefits of REACH to the environment, to our food supply, and all the rest, but to us as companies. First, we maintain our market access globally. And second, when we begin collecting the substance information, we can use it to mitigate our supply chain risks. If you read some of the recent purchasing magazines, they're all talking about supply chain risk. Materials in the past couple of years have gone up and made up for all the cost reductions over the past century. We are starting to see some shortages of different materials as new sources need to be found. We know there's geopolitical risk growing, countries that have tried to corner the supply of different materials and the refining of them. We need to identify what's in our products, where they come from, to begin to make plans to avoid those risks. As we've seen with the tsunamis, with some of the weather pattern changes, we have to know where the basic substances, materials, and products we're using come from, so we can better plan to avoid supply chain disruption. The next big one is, if I'm an OEM, when my product I built today reaches its end of life in 20 years, 10 years, 30 years, if I have this information, I can go back and calculate the raw material value and what it's going to take to recover it from my product, and decide, does it make sense to take the product back for a discount on new products to keep customers loyal and using my equipment. Ships built 30 years ago are worth as much today in scrap as they were retail when they were initially sold. On our larger equipment, there's no reason to believe that our value proposition is a whole lot different. And if we collect the data once and do it right, it can be verified against changing regulatory regulations globally, new ones that come up without having to go through a fire drill. And it can be integrated into our processes. The bottom line is, this can give us a pretty good competitive advantage as we go into the new business paradigm where all this data is part of the product we sell. And I'm a person who believes if I've got it, I better market it, and I want to use it as a reason to buy from me. So, massive problem, how do I get started? The AEM MAP program includes training on REACH and compliance. We have the executive awareness modules so the top management and people in our company can be aware of what the real risks are as an overview. We have in-depth managerial training on what the items I've just spoken about are going to entail and the requirements for the company. So we have a better feel for that. And we're developing the operational training that will teach the people actually collecting the data, verifying it, rolling it up, and passing along our supply chain, how to do it in a way that will be consistent. So if we get consistent data, we can do a consistent evaluation. We also have the REACH Executive Brief, which will keep you up to date on information on legal changes, substances, and related legislations, have discussions on best practices, and various columns on compliance experts to help us be aware of what's coming, of trends and approaches. And also within this program, developing the common industry tools for data collection and exchange that can be used with everybody's existing in-house PLM or other tools, keeping a way to do this as a common way throughout the industry to minimize our costs. And so the bottom line is, we can't afford to wait. This is a major project. It's a process from starting, to finding out what our highest risks are and moving down through the products. It's a multi-year program, and it will take time to have everything we properly need. So we need to start today. And I want thank you for participating in this webinar. And if you need more information, please feel free to contact John Wagner at AEM or myself. And with that, we can go forward. So just in summary, we hope that this has given you the basis to go forward and learn more about the EU REACH regulations. Keep in mind, AEM is here to help you grow your business and keep AEM in mind. And think about going and accessing their resources as your next business challenges occur. And talk to us to see how AEM can help you provide solutions. Once again, today's webinar is part of the 2014 AEM Member Outreach Program designed to help AEM member companies maximize your membership value. You have business challenges, industry issues to face, and we help offer solutions. And for more information, once again, visit the AEM website, click on Membership, maximize your membership value.